A few years ago, I accepted a job as a park ranger. I had always loved the nature. This is where I can be myself and just think about life. Therefore, I found this job to be the perfect opportunity for me to really connect with the nature. I was hired at the Pine Hollow National Forest as a park ranger, which meant I would live in the woods and help tourists and hikers, as well as make reports on the wildlife in the area, so the rangers know what kind of animals are in the area and what they are doing. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at Pine Hollow National Forest was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt comforting. Rather, it was a deep, thick silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. My truck's tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled up to the ranger station, a modest structure nestled within the embrace of ancient trees. The weathered wooden building stood as a sentinel over the surrounding forest, its paint chipped and faded from years of exposure to the elements. I stepped out, inhaling the fresh, crisp air, laced with the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. This was my dream, living amongst nature away from the chaos of the city. I had envisioned this moment for years, and yet, as I stood there, the knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened. There was something unnerving about the stillness of the forest, a sense of anticipation that set my teeth on edge. The ranger station was sparsely furnished, with a small desk piled high with maps, forms, and guidebooks. An old wooden chair sat in the corner, its paint chipped and peeling. I crossed the threshold, and the door creaked ominously behind me, echoing in the quiet. Inside, I could see the faint traces of sunlight filtering through the dust-coated windows, casting ethereal patterns on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of wood and something else, something musty, like long-forgotten memories. As I began unpacking my belongings, a chill crept up my spine. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, but I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I was alone here, and I needed to embrace that solitude. I made a mental note to explore the area, to familiarize myself with the trails and the park's many hidden gems. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I forced myself to concentrate on my tasks, organizing gear and preparing for the coming days. But the shadows deepening outside my window drew my gaze. They seemed to stretch and bend, reaching toward me with skeletal fingers. The first night settled in with an unsettling quiet. I decided to take a walk around the station, hoping that some fresh air would help clear my mind. Armed with my flashlight, I stepped outside, the beams slicing through the encroaching darkness. The forest loomed before me, the trees swaying gently in the cool night breeze. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night owl, but it all felt eerily muted, as if the world were holding its breath. As I walked along the path, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots echoed in the silence, a reminder of my presence in this vast wilderness. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of life, but all I could hear was the rhythmic thumping of my own heartbeat. It felt as if the forest was watching me, every branch and leaf an observer in the dark. When I reached a small clearing, I stopped to take in my surroundings. Moonlight spilled over the ground, illuminating wildflowers and tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, a scene straight from a postcard, but the beauty felt tainted, overshadowed by the sense of something lurking just beyond my line of sight. I turned to head back to the ranger station when I caught a flicker of movement in the shadows. My heart raced as I froze, flashlight beam dancing over the underbrush. For a moment, I thought I saw something dart between the trees, but when I focused my light, all that met my gaze were the whispering shadows of the forest. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. "It's just your imagination," I murmured, trying to convince myself as I retraced my steps back to the safety of the station. The door clicked shut behind me, and I locked it, the sound of the bolt sliding into place bringing a momentary sense of security. Settling into my desk chair, I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me like a wet blanket. I flipped through the visitor logbook, reading entries from families who had come to experience the beauty of Pine Hollow. There were names I recognized from the Welcome Center, notes about hiking trails and campfires, laughter echoing in the distance. But there were also a few entries that sent shivers down my spine. Accounts of strange sounds at night, the unsettling feeling of being watched, and even a few mentions of lost hikers who had wandered too far into the woods and never returned. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. What kind of forest had I stepped into? As the darkness thickened outside, I decided to turn on the radio, hoping to drown out my thoughts with the comforting sound of music. I fiddled with the dials, but instead of the familiar tunes, all I got was static, a low, eerie hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life with a burst of static, followed by a low, almost unintelligible murmur. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned closer, straining to hear. The voice was distant, barely more than a whisper, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It felt as if someone were trying to communicate, but the words slipped away like smoke. I quickly turned the radio off, the sudden silence in the room almost deafening. That night, sleep eluded me. I tossed and turned in my bed, the shadows of the forest creeping closer as the darkness deepened. Every creak of the building, every rustle outside my window, sent my heart racing. I stared at the ceiling, willing myself to relax, but the whispers of the forest echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that I was not alone. Morning came, breaking through the gloom with a soft light that filtered through the trees. I rose groggily, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. The sun glinted off the dew-covered grass, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace as I stepped outside. The air was cool but crisp, invigorating in a way that made me feel alive. As I walked through the woods, I tried to shake off the anxiety that had gripped me. I focused on my surroundings, the way the sunlight played through the branches, the distant sound of a stream bubbling over rocks, and the scent of pine that enveloped me like a warm embrace. It was breathtaking, but as I continued my morning patrol, I couldn't ignore the odd sensations that lingered from the night before. It was subtle, like a whisper at the back of my mind, a nagging feeling that something was off. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to my inexperience. After all, I was in a new environment, and the wilderness could be overwhelming. I spent the day getting acquainted with my surroundings, mapping out the trails and learning the geography of the area. I met a few campers along the way, families eager to explore the park's beauty. They smiled, their laughter ringing through the trees, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of camaraderie. But even their joy couldn't fully erase the disquiet that lingered within me. As night approached, I made my way back to the ranger station. I set up a small campfire outside, determined to push through the mounting anxiety that accompanied the darkness. I carefully arranged the wood, striking a match to ignite the flames. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows that danced against the backdrop of the trees. I settled down with a cup of coffee, staring into the flames as they flickered and popped. The warmth radiated from the fire, pushing back the chill of the evening air. I allowed myself to relax, immersing in the comforting crackle of burning wood, but the night felt different, heavier. The trees, usually so vibrant, seemed to loom closer, their dark silhouettes pressing in around me. As I gazed into the fire, I heard a rustling sound nearby. My heart leaped, and I turned, flashlight in hand, scanning the perimeter of the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows dancing in the underbrush. I chuckled nervously, reminding myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon rummaging through the leaves. But then, I heard it again, a faint whisper carried by the wind. It was low, indistinct, yet unmistakably there, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I strained to listen, but the sound faded into the night, swallowed by the forest. I stood up, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. I was alone here, and yet I felt an oppressive presence lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. I extinguished the flames, plunging myself into darkness once more, the abrupt absence of warmth unsettling. With the last embers smoldering, I retreated inside the ranger station, locking the door behind me. The silence was deafening as I sat in the dim light, the shadows pressing in, amplifying my anxiety. Hours passed, and I found myself staring at the walls, listening for any sign of disturbance outside. I kept my flashlight close, feeling like a child afraid of the dark. Every creak of the building echoed in my ears, and I could almost swear I heard something tapping lightly against the window. I held my breath, focusing intently, but when I finally mustered the courage to look, nothing met my gaze. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreams filled with whispers and shadows that skittered just out of reach. When I woke, it was to the sound of scratching, soft, persistent scratching against the wooden walls of the station. My heart raced as I bolted upright, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. It was real, a sound that sent chills coursing through me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the door, pausing to listen again. The scratching had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that hung heavy in the air. I slowly opened the door, the hinges creaking as I stepped into the cool morning light. The forest was still, the only sound the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I scanned the area, searching for any sign of what might have caused the noise, but all I found were the remnants of the previous night, the embers of my fire, and the scattered leaves beneath the trees. It felt as if the forest itself had conspired to erase any evidence of the disturbances I had sensed. For the next few days, I tried to focus on my work, monitoring trails and checking in on campers. I did my best to ignore the whispers in the woods and the scratching at night, but my efforts were in vain. Each night brought a renewed sense of dread, and I began to question my sanity. Was I truly hearing things, or was there something lurking just beyond the trees? As the days turned into weeks, my anxiety escalated. I found myself avoiding the forest during the dark hours, preferring the safety of the ranger station. My dreams were haunted by shadows that danced just out of sight, figures that darted between trees, always just beyond my reach. Each time I woke, drenched in sweat, I would lie still in bed, listening to the silence outside, half expecting to hear that scratching sound again. I tried to rationalize my fears. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Being alone in the woods for too long can play tricks on the mind. I spent my days reading, researching the flora and fauna of Pine Hollow, and keeping detailed logs of everything I observed. It was a distraction, a way to focus on the tangible rather than the creeping dread that had taken root in my mind. But every evening, as dusk settled over the forest, a familiar tension would build within me. I would sit at my desk, eyes glued to the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The first few nights, I would step outside with my flashlight, shining it into the darkness, hoping to chase away the shadows that loomed. On one particularly haunting evening, I decided to venture out to the small clearing where I had first encountered that unsettling feeling. I needed to confront my fears. Armed with my flashlight and a sense of determination, I made my way to the spot, the beam of light illuminating the path ahead. The moment I stepped into the clearing, a gust of wind swept through, rustling the leaves and sending a chill down my spine. I shivered, the air suddenly feeling heavier, almost electric. As I stood there, taking in my surroundings, I noticed something peculiar, an unusual pattern in the dirt, like the impression of a large paw print, deep and fresh. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to examine it, heart pounding wildly. Just then, I heard a low growl, a sound that sent ice coursing through my veins. I stood abruptly, flashlights sweeping over the trees, searching for the source of the noise. The shadows seemed to shift, a dark mass moving just beyond the beam of my light. My heart raced, and I fought the urge to run. Instead, I stood frozen, straining to hear. But then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I took a shaky breath, reminding myself that the forest was filled with creatures, and the sound could have easily been a bear or a coyote. I forced myself to turn back toward the ranger station, but the growl echoed in my mind, a sinister reminder of my vulnerability. The following days blurred into one another as the unease settled deeper into my bones. I began to avoid the clearing, focusing instead on the more traveled trails. But the forest felt different now, like a living entity with eyes watching my every move. I could sense the weight of it all, the way the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches curling in like a protective barrier. Even the days turned strange. The sun felt too bright, and the shadows stretched longer, creeping toward me as if trying to grasp at my heels. I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on my duties. I wrote lengthy reports, meticulously documenting the weather patterns and trail conditions. But my mind wandered constantly back to the sounds of the night, the scratching, the growl that echoed in the darkness. It was during one of my night shifts that I first saw it. The forest was bathed in moonlight, and I stood outside the ranger station, the cool breeze brushing against my skin. I was scanning the treeline when movement caught my eye, a flicker of white, almost ghostly, slipping between the trees. My heart dropped, and I took a hesitant step closer, flashlight raised. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling as it broke the stillness. The beam of light pierced through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. The shadows danced mockingly around me, and I felt that familiar knot of dread tightening in my chest. I stood there, straining to listen, my heart racing as the silence enveloped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen was watching me too. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I backed away slowly, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly as I turned to head back inside. Just as I reached for the door, I heard it again, the scratching sound, now more pronounced, reverberating against the walls of the station. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly, feeling a surge of panic rising within me. My breath came in short bursts as I sank down into my chair, the darkness closing in around me. I spent the remainder of the night wide awake, every noise outside sending my heart racing. I stared at the walls, imagining shapes moving in the shadows. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled outside, the light a welcome relief against the oppressive darkness. I took deep breaths, grounding myself in the warmth of the sun, but the tension remained. Weeks passed, and my mind began to spiral. I found myself trapped in a cycle of fear and anxiety, the forest becoming both my sanctuary and my prison. I threw myself into my duties during the day, keeping busy with trail maintenance and checking on campers. But as night fell, the forest transformed into something sinister. I avoided the clearing and spent my evenings inside the ranger station, locking the door behind me as if it could keep the darkness at bay. The whispers of the forest haunted my thoughts, creeping in during the quiet moments when my mind began to wander. I filled my nights with radio static and the soft glow of a lantern, but the darkness felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. It was on one particularly restless night that I decided to confront my fears head-on. The scratching had grown more frequent, a persistent reminder that something was lurking just beyond my door. I grabbed my flashlight, determination coursing through me. I would find out what was happening. I stepped outside, the beam of light cutting through the darkness as I made my way to the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest, each step echoing in the silence. As I approached the spot, I felt the air shift, an electric tension hanging heavy in the atmosphere. I scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to look away. The eyes were unnaturally bright, piercing through the darkness like twin stars. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs as I stood transfixed. Suddenly, the creature moved, slipping silently between the trees. I felt an instinctual urge to run, to flee back to the safety of the ranger station, but my feet remained rooted in place. I was torn between terror and an overwhelming curiosity. What was it? Was it real? The night air grew colder, and I took a hesitant step forward, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The woods remained silent, the only sound my own breath quickening in the stillness. I strained to listen, but the only response was the rustle of leaves in the wind. And then it happened. A low growl erupted from the shadows, resonating deep within my chest. My instincts kicked in, and I turned on my heel, sprinting back toward the station. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, illuminating the trees around me, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light whole. I stumbled into the ranger station, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I leaned against the door, heart racing as I tried to catch my breath. The growl echoed in my mind, a primal sound that made my skin crawl. Whatever was out, there was no ordinary animal. It was something darker, something ancient. I spent the rest of the night on edge, listening to the sounds of the forest. Each rustle, each whisper felt amplified in the silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. My sleep-deprived mind began to play tricks on me, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, and I found myself questioning every sound, every movement outside. The following morning, I awoke to the sun filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow over the ranger station. I stumbled out of bed, groggy and disoriented, trying to shake off the remnants of the night's terror. I stepped outside, squinting against the brightness, and took a deep breath of fresh air. The warmth of the sun felt reassuring, grounding me in reality. But the forest still loomed, its presence heavy and foreboding. I needed to regain my focus, to push through the fog of fear that had settled over me. I forced myself to go through the motions, checking on the trails and ensuring everything was in order, but the unease lingered just beneath the surface. It was during one of my patrols that I encountered something strange. As I walked along a familiar path, I noticed fresh markings on the trees, deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way up the bark. My stomach dropped as I traced my fingers over the gnarled grooves, unease creeping in once more. I continued along the trail, feeling increasingly uneasy as I approached the clearing. The memories of that night haunted me, but I was determined to confront my fears. I stepped into the open space, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The clearing was still, but a sense of wrongness hung in the air, a palpable tension that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye, a flash of white darting between the trees. My heart raced as I turned, flashlight ready, but again, it vanished into the shadows. I called out, my voice trembling, "Show yourself!" Silence enveloped me, a heavy shroud that pressed against my chest. The world felt suffocating, the trees closing in around me. I took a step back, feeling the instinctual urge to flee, but the desire to confront whatever haunted me held me in place. I needed to know the truth, and then it appeared, a figure emerging from the darkness, slender and graceful, its form barely discernible against the backdrop of the trees. My heart raced as I focused on it, breath hitching in my throat. It looked almost human, but something was undeniably off. Its skin was pale, almost luminescent, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest as the figure moved closer. I felt a mix of fear and fascination as I watched it glide through the underbrush, its movements fluid and unnaturally graceful. The closer it got, the more I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a connection that sent shivers coursing down my spine. But as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished back into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the clearing, breathless and trembling. I staggered back, shock coursing through me as I fought to comprehend what I had just witnessed. What was it? Had I really seen it? Or had my mind finally unraveled in the depths of the forest? That night, I locked the door and settled into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with images of the pale figure. It haunted me, lingering on the edge of my consciousness. I woke several times, drenched in sweat, the echoes of its glowing eyes haunting my thoughts. Each time I drifted off again, I felt its presence nearby, watching me waiting. On the third night, as I lay awake, I heard the familiar scratching sound return. It was persistent, scraping against the walls, almost rhythmic. My heart raced as I listened, trying to decipher the sound. It was like nails against wood, a low, drawn-out sound that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and stepped outside. The air was thick with tension, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest. As I stood there, a sense of dread washed over me, but I pushed through it, determined to confront whatever awaited me. I made my way to the clearing, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The scratching grew louder, echoing in the stillness of the night. I stepped into the open space, scanning the area, but it was empty, save for the shadows that twisted in the moonlight. And then I saw it again, the pale figure, standing at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, fear coursing through me. It turned to face me, its eyes glowing brighter in the darkness, and I felt an overwhelming urge to approach it. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees, leaving me standing alone in the clearing. I staggered back, heart racing, my mind reeling with confusion and fear. Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? The scratching grew louder, echoing around me, and I turned, panic rising within me. I sprinted back to the ranger station, locking the door behind me. I sank into my chair, trembling as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The whispers of the forest surrounded me, a chorus of voices that seeped into my thoughts, taunting me with their secrets. Days passed, but my anxiety only deepened. I became a prisoner of my own mind, the forest closing in around me. I avoided the clearing and focused solely on my work. But even during the day, I felt the weight of the forest bearing down on me. Shadows danced at the corners of my vision, and every rustle sent my heart racing. I began to research the history of Pine Hollow, desperate for answers. I combed through old records and park archives, seeking any mention of the strange occurrences I had experienced. I uncovered tales of hikers who had vanished without a trace, stories of whispers in the woods, and the lingering presence of the unknown. It was as if the forest held its breath, guarding its secrets closely. I stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping that detailed the tragic tale of a group of hikers who had disappeared decades ago. They had ventured into the woods, seeking adventure, but none had returned. The article was filled with ominous warnings, tales of eerie sounds, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. The park rangers at the time had deemed the area unsafe, warning others to stay away. A sense of dread filled me as I read those words. Was I caught in the same trap? Had I unwittingly stepped into a story that was repeating itself? I felt a chill creeping down my spine as I pondered the implications. The whispers of the forest grew louder in my mind, echoing the tales of the past. It was during one of my evening patrols that I felt a shift in the air. The forest seemed to come alive, a chorus of whispers swirling around me. I turned sharply, feeling a presence behind me. The trees swayed as if responding to an unseen force, and I felt an icy grip clutching at my heart. And then it happened. The pale figure emerged from the shadows once more, gliding toward me with an otherworldly grace. My breath hitched as I stood frozen in place, paralyzed by fear and fascination. The figure stopped just short of me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming rush of emotion wash over me. Fear, sorrow, longing. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I struggled to understand the entity before me. The figure tilted its head, and for a fleeting moment, I felt an unspoken connection, a bond that transcended language. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a reminder of the forest's mysteries and the darkness that lay within. And just as quickly as it had appeared, it slipped back into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the clearing, heart racing. The whispers grew louder that night, a cacophony of voices swirling around me as I lay in bed. I could feel their presence, an unseen force tugging at the edges of my consciousness. I clutched my blanket, heart pounding as I struggled to silence the voices. I needed to escape, to break free from the grip of the forest, but I felt trapped, ensnared by its darkness. The days rolled on, and with each passing moment, I felt the invisible thread connecting me to the forest grow tighter, more suffocating. It was a sensation that crept into my bones, an inescapable reality that this place, once a sanctuary, was morphing into a prison. Each evening, as twilight descended, I braced myself for the encroaching darkness, an ominous force that whispered of things lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. The figure had become my constant tormentor, appearing in my mind's eye with an ethereal grace that was both captivating and horrifying. I tried to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination, a trick played by the isolation of the forest. But my resolve faltered each time the scratching returned, persistent and taunting, echoing against the walls of the ranger station. I wondered what it wanted, what it sought from me. I felt like an intruder in its domain, an unwelcome guest in the wild tapestry of Pine Hollow. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt an urge to confront my fears once more. It was a reckless decision, one born from frustration and a desperate need for clarity. I gathered my gear, armed with a flashlight and a notepad, determined to document whatever I encountered. I would not be a victim of my own imagination. I would confront whatever awaited me in the shadows. As I stepped into the clearing, the air grew heavy, thick with an electric tension that made my skin prickle. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, illuminating the twisted shapes of the trees. I took a deep breath, heart pounding in my chest, and called out into the night. "Show yourself." For a moment, silence reigned, wrapping around me like a shroud. But then, from the depths of the forest, I heard it, the soft scratching, a sound that clawed at the edges of my sanity. It was closer now, resonating with a chilling familiarity that sent waves of fear crashing over me. I shined my flashlight toward the noise, its beam slicing through the darkness. Shadows danced around me, teasing my senses, and I felt a deep-rooted primal fear take hold. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what I was experiencing. Was it a predator, a ghost, or something even darker? As I stood there, frozen in the silence, I heard a low growl, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the clearing, sending a shiver down my spine. The air felt charged with energy, and I could almost taste the fear lingering in the atmosphere. I took a step back, instinctively preparing to flee, when suddenly a figure broke through the underbrush. It moved with an unnatural grace, slipping into the light of my flashlight as if it were a wisp of smoke. My breath hitched as I caught sight of it. The pale figure, its skin shimmering in the moonlight, stood just beyond the edge of the clearing. Its eyes glowed with an intensity that felt like a beacon, drawing me in even as terror clawed at my insides. "Who are you?" I whispered, voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, a gesture that sent a jolt of recognition coursing through me. In that moment, I felt a rush of emotions, fear, sorrow, longing, like a floodgate had opened within me. And then it spoke, but the words were lost in the wind, swirling around me like leaves caught in a storm. I strained to listen, to grasp what it was trying to convey, but the only sound was the relentless scratching that had followed me, a constant reminder of the unease that had settled into my heart. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight wavering as panic set in. The figure remained still, watching me with those piercing eyes, and I felt as if it were waiting for me to make a choice. I turned and fled, sprinting back toward the ranger station, heart racing and breath coming in gasps. The following days blurred together in a haze of anxiety and dread. I tried to immerse myself in my work, but even the simplest tasks felt monumental under the weight of my fear. I avoided the clearing, convinced that it was a nexus for whatever haunted the forest. The scratching sounds continued to plague my nights, and I spent more time locked inside the ranger station, feeling like a fragile wisp of sanity in an unforgiving wilderness. But my determination to understand what was happening forced me to confront my fears. I researched local legends and folklore, hoping to find some explanation for the strange figure and the eerie occurrences. I discovered tales of entities that lurked in the woods, guardians of nature turned malevolent due to human transgressions. Each story resonated with the growing darkness around me, igniting my imagination with fear and fascination. One evening, as I sat in the fading light, I decided to document everything: the encounters, the feelings, the unshakable sense of being watched. I needed to capture the truth of what was happening before it consumed me entirely. My hands trembled as I wrote, each stroke of the pen a desperate plea for clarity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt that familiar weight in my chest, the onset of anxiety clawing at my mind. I tried to push through it, forcing myself to focus on the words in front of me. But the shadows outside my window grew longer, more pronounced, creeping toward the station like tendrils of darkness reaching for me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew I had to go back to the clearing. I needed to confront the figure again, to understand its intentions. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way outside, heart pounding as I stepped into the cool night air. As I approached the clearing, the world felt different, charged with an energy that pulsed beneath the surface. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches whispering secrets in the breeze. I stood at the edge of the clearing, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then I heard it, the scratching, louder now, almost a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the forest. My heart raced as I turned my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the trees that encircled me. Shadows danced, but I could see nothing. "Show yourself," I called out, desperation creeping into my voice. For a moment, silence enveloped me, and I felt an inexplicable dread wash over me. I felt as if I were being pulled into the abyss, the shadows stretching out to claim me. But then it appeared, gliding into the clearing once more, the pale figure, its eyes glowing like lanterns in the dark. This time, I was ready to confront it. "What do you want?" I demanded, voice steady despite the tremors in my hands. The figure stepped forward, and in that moment, I was struck by a wave of emotion that made my heart ache. I felt its sorrow, its anger, and the weight of centuries of pain. It was as if we were connected in some profound way, the boundaries of our existence dissolving in the face of its haunting presence. I stepped forward, feeling an urge to reach out to it, to understand. But then, the scratching returned, a harsh reminder of the darkness lurking in the shadows. I stumbled back, fear rising once more as I felt the pressure of unseen eyes watching from the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurked just beyond the light. "Please," I whispered, "tell me what you want." But the figure only stared, those glowing eyes filled with an unfathomable depth. The atmosphere grew heavy, the air thick with tension, and I felt a sense of foreboding settle over me like a cold blanket. I needed to escape, to break free from the connection that was suffocating me. I turned and fled back to the ranger station, heart racing as I slammed the door behind me. I leaned against it, breathless and trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figure lingered in my mind, a haunting presence that refused to be forgotten. The following week was marked by an unsettling shift in the atmosphere. The forest felt more alive than ever, and I began to notice subtle changes. Faint whispers that danced on the wind, shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The scratching continued, but it was now accompanied by a low growl that reverberated through the trees, a primal sound that sent chills racing down my spine.